Welcome once again. Great to have you with us today, as always, of course. You know, as followers of Jesus Christ, we're not always sure exactly what we should do in some situations. One question that occasionally comes up is that of self-defense, or the defense of others. Some tell us that we should never defend ourselves from any physical attack on our person. I'd like to look at that today. Can Christians defend themselves? In other words, if someone physically attacks us, can we fight back? Or should we just allow the assault to continue? Does the Bible allow us to use force, even deadly force, to repel an attacker? Well, I attended a church many years ago where their answer was no. They say we should never physically defend ourselves since our defense could possibly result in the death of the attacker. It's not that the actual death of the attacker was ever our intention, just that it always remains a possibility, however remote. Anytime physical force is used against someone, there's always that risk of injury or even death. And of course, Jesus told us to love our enemies. You can read it in Matthew 5, verse 44, Luke 6, verse 27, and Luke 6, verse 35. Jesus also told us that if we're hit on one cheek, to turn the other cheek. But what do we think? What do we believe? And of course, most importantly, why? Does our Bible teach that we should never defend ourselves, or others for that matter? Well, one of the arguments prohibiting the use of any force in self-defense goes something like this. This is what someone told me. Let's say, for example, if, we'll call him a bad guy, was trying to burst through our doorway, intending us harm, of course. Even attempting to push them back out could cause them to stumble, maybe fall on a concrete step, and that could result in their death, even though we had no intention of doing so. Practicing almost any use of force has the potential for the death of someone, even if that probability is very low. So in other words, there's really little anyone can do, in most cases, to defend themselves or others with an absolute 100% sure chance that nothing can go wrong, if you will. And of course, any attack on our person would likely surprise us. We'd have little time to think about this and come up with some kind of careful defensive plan that would be totally safe, even if such a plan might even exist in that situation in the first place. So a friend once told me that we can never take even the slightest chance that we might injure someone or kill them, since that would break one of God's commandments. And of course, they cite the 6th commandment that says, "Thou shalt not kill." Let's turn over, if you would, to Exodus 20, verse 13, and take a look at this. That's Exodus 20, 13. That's where the 10 commandments are. And take a look at this 6th commandment there, Exodus 20, verse 13. Now, if we take this verse in the King James literally, then we should never kill, period. We should never kill another human being. We should never kill an animal, even for food. That would be killing. Hunting, of course, would be a sin. The animal sacrifices in the Old Testament would be sin, despite that they were commanded by God in the first place. And I suppose the same could be said for plants too. Killing them would be wrong, if we're not to kill, period. Our diets would be severely limited if neither plants nor animals could be killed and eaten, obviously, even though God told us that there were clean animals we could eat. So Exodus 20, verse 13, let's look over there again. As I said before, we need to be careful with the English translations, since it's not unusual for a word to be translated incorrectly or lack the same scope and meaning of the original word. So again here, Exodus 20, verse 13 says, "Thou shalt not kill," here in the King James. Now the word kill here is, in Strong's, it's the Hebrew word 7523. It's rasak, and it means to kill a human being, especially to murder. So the word translated as kill here in the King James should be actually translated as murder, not kill. And that's just the King James, though. We'll find that most all other English translations translate this word as murder. If you're reading anything other than the King James, that word is probably murder. In fact, let me read you some examples. The contemporary English version says, do not murder. Easy to read version says, you must not murder anyone. Good News Bible, do not commit murder. God's Word, never murder. International Standard Version, you're not to murder. Revised Version, you shall do no murder. The Bible in Basic English, do not put anyone to death without cause. Now later, even in the King James Bible, we find Jesus listing some of the commandments. And if you look, you'll find in Matthew 19, verse 18, Jesus says, you shall do no murder. And he was repeating that sixth commandment. So the sixth commandment is about murder, not just killing. And we should never commit murder. Or as the Bible in Basic English puts it, as we said, we should never put anyone to death without cause. Now from dictionary.com, the definition of the word murder is the intentional killing of someone or the killing of someone as a result of complete disregard for their life. Now, we never want to kill anyone. It should never be our intention to kill an attacker, or anyone else for that matter. We only want to stop this vicious attack, an attack on ourselves and maybe an attack on our loved ones, maybe even an attack on another helpless individual. Now, another reason that some say that we should never defend ourselves is that it shows that we really don't trust God to keep us safe, that we don't believe God can protect us. So we should never defend ourselves because that demonstrates that our faith is very, very weak. But if we believe that, if that's what we believe, then we will never see a doctor, because that too would show our mistrust of God to protect us from illness or maybe to heal us without seeking help from others. Taking medicine, that would be the same thing. Perhaps God places resources there for us to use. Maybe we shouldn't always ignore them. Okay, I'd like to tell you an old joke that might help illustrate my point. I know that many of you have told me before to never tell jokes because I'm just not any good at it. And I recognize that, but you know what? I'm going to try it again anyway. So here goes. Here's an old joke. Related, of course, to our discussion today. So this farmer in Kentucky is in the middle of a great big flood. A nearby river is overflowing. He finds water surrounding his home. It's all the way up to his porch. As he's standing there, a boat comes up. The man in the boat yells, "Hey, jump in. I'll take you to safety." Well, the farmer crosses his arms and says stubbornly, "No thanks. I put my trust in God." The boat goes away. Soon, the water rises up to the second story of his home. Another boat comes by. The man says to the farmer, who's now at his second floor window at this time, "Hey, jump in. I'll save you." The farmer again says, "No thanks. I put my trust in God." That boat goes away. Now the water is starting to get over his roof. As the farmer stands on his roof, a helicopter comes over and drops a ladder down. The pilot yells down to the farmer, "I'll save you. Climb the ladder. Climb the ladder to safety." The farmer yells back, "No thanks. I put my trust in God." The helicopter goes away. The water continues to rise and eventually sweeps the farmer right off the roof and into the swiftly moving water, carries him downstream. Unfortunately, the farmer drowns. When the farmer is resurrected, he complains to God. He said, "God, hey, I put my trust in you and you let me down." God replied, "What do you mean, let you down? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter." Okay, there's my joke. I know, I can't tell a joke, but I hope you get the point of this, okay? The idea is to get the point, not necessarily to laugh at my joke. But anyway, we need to take responsibility for our welfare and that of our families. What we can't do for ourselves, we need to trust in God to do for us. And I've seen God rescue people, if you will, in all manner of ways. It's not always what we think. But let's get back to our topic. So I was in a church once that taught that the use of any potential deadly force for defense was absolutely a sin. After services one day, I asked some of the men about a hypothetical situation. I got them away from everybody else because it was a hot topic. And here's the question I asked them, a hypothetical question. I said, let's just suppose for a moment that you live in the country and you just came back from a hunting trip. You sit your loaded shotgun down by your chair to rest a bit. Now, I'm not suggesting we do that. That isn't very safe. But this is a hypothetical, of course. Now, suddenly your front door flies open, and a crazed-looking man comes to the door holding a machete. And he announces he intends to kill your whole family and heads in the direction of your children and your wife. In that case, I asked them, what would you do? Now, what do you think the men said? I asked this question. This is a real thing that happened. And I was curious as to what they would say because, as far as I knew, all of them believed that any defense of oneself was sin. So how did these three men answer that question? Well, the first man said that, and I'm serious here, the first man said that he would have to assume that this was God's will and he would sit and do nothing. Whatever happened, well, that's what happened. So I asked the second man the same question. And he said he really wasn't sure. In that situation, he would have to be there. He couldn't say for sure what would happen. So he kind of declined to answer the question. So I asked the third man, the last man I actually asked. And he said, I just don't believe I could sit there and watch my family be attacked or murdered. He said, I would probably grab that loaded shotgun, demand the man stop this attack. And if he refused, I would attempt to stop him in any way I could, up to and including the use of that shotgun. Now, this is from a man attending a church that said that murder is sin, killing is sin. Let's turn to 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. What about this situation I just talked about, this hypothetical? Should we defend our family? Is it our duty to protect our families? In addition to providing food and shelter, are we to provide for their protection for those who might seek to harm them as well? Again, 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. But if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel or an unbeliever. Now, to me, providing for our own house, our family, means providing food and shelter and protection or defense for those who depend on us. All those contribute to their well-being, of course, to keep them healthy and well. I'll tell you what, let's turn over to Nehemiah chapter 4. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. We'll begin at the beginning. I can see what happens over there. I'll set it up for you. Here, King Artaxerxes had allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Now they began to repair the gates and the wall. We might recall from Nehemiah 2, verse 10 and 2, verse 19, that Sanballat and Tobiah really despised the Jews. They hated them. So let's see how things went when the Jews began to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem. Again, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth, and took great indignation, and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren in the army of Samaria, and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was with him, or by him. And he said, Even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. They were making fun of him. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity. And cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders. So they weren't too happy with the Jews. They didn't like them very well. They wished evil for them. Verse 6. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. So the Jews had returned to Jerusalem and had begun to rebuild the wall. They were working along at a pretty good pace, it looks like. Let's see what happens in verse 7. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, they were very wroth, and conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. So they were planning to attack Jerusalem before they'd be able to get that wall ready for their defense. Verse 9. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Now the Jews knew they were planning to attack them. They just didn't know exactly when to expect an attack. Verse 10. And Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. So apparently the task of building the wall was more difficult perhaps than they'd first thought. It was in pretty bad shape, but of course they continued anyway. But now with more rubbish to clear, more than expected, there was probably no chance they'd have the wall ready in time to protect them from this, what they believed was an imminent attack. Verse 11. And our adversary said, they shall not know, neither see, till we come in the midst among them, and slay them, and cause the work to cease. And it came to pass that when the Jews which dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, from all places where ye shall return unto us, they will be upon you. So this imminent attack was probably more than just a small rumor. The Jews living near these people had heard all about it, and they warned their fellow Jews building that wall 10 times that an attack was coming. Verse 13. Therefore said I in the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places, I even set the people after their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. So we see that Nehemiah armed the Jews, so they would be ready for battle when that attack came. Verse 14. And I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, be not you afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses. So Nehemiah told the people to fight for their brethren, their sons and their daughters, their wives and their houses. Verse 15. And it came to pass, when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, every one unto his work. And it came to pass from that time forth that the half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both the spears, the shields, the bows, and the habergeons, and the rulers were behind all the house of Judah. So it looks like only half the people were actually doing any work. The other half were armed and ready for combat. They had shields, spears, and bows, and they had some body armor, the habergeons. Verse 17. They which builded on the wall, and they that bare burdens with those that laded, every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. Even the people actively working on the wall were also armed. They worked with one hand and held a weapon in the other. Verse 18. For the builders, every one had his sword girded by his side, and so builded. And he that sounded the trumpet was by me. I said to the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, the work is great and large, and we are separated upon the wall, one far from another. In what place, therefore, you hear the sound of the trumpet, resort you thither to us, our God shall fight for us. Now they believed that God would fight for them, but they were prepared to do their part and be ready to defend themselves if they needed to. Verse 21. So we labored in the work, and half of them held the spears from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. Likewise, at the same time, said I unto the people, let every one with his servant lodge within Jerusalem, that in the night he may be a guard to us, and labor on the day. So neither I nor my brethren nor my servants or the men of the guard which followed me, none of us put off our clothes, saving that every one put them off for washing. Wow. So they remained ready. They even remained fully clothed, except for when they bathed. That way they were immediately ready anytime a fight might break out. They were ready to go. They were prepared. Excuse me. But the point I wanted to make is that the Jews were armed and ready to fight if they were attacked. They were not only protecting themselves individually, but also we saw they were to protect their families and their brethren, their neighbors. I'd like to also point out that they could have abandoned the rebuilding of the wall and just run away. They could have always done that, but they didn't. They stayed and continued to work on the wall, despite the potential danger they faced in doing so. And like them, we don't always have to run away. Not always. Let's turn over to Psalms 82, verse 3. That's Psalms 82, verse 3. Here's a question for you. Should we maybe defend others in addition to our own families? Or should we just ignore the rest of the world and just take care of ourselves? I plan to speak next week about our relationship to the world, despite us not being in it. But should we defend others as well as our own families? Is that something we should do, or should we mind our own business? What do you think? Let's look again at Psalms 82, verse 3. Here's what it says. Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them out of the hand of the wicked. Now, this might be my opinion, but it seems to me here that we're to also defend those who can't defend themselves. But again, that's my opinion. Now, what about Jesus Christ? What does he have to say in all this? Well, in Matthew 5, verse 39, Jesus says, whoever shall smite you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now here Jesus was suffering an insult. The smiting of the right cheek wasn't likely to cause any serious injury to Jesus. But if you read that passage, we won't turn there today, but you can look at it later if you want. But you might notice that Jesus was very specific when he mentioned the right cheek. Why did he mention the right cheek? What difference does it make if we're smote on the right cheek or the left? I wonder why he would say that. Well, here's one possible answer for you. Now, some people believe this. You know, most people are right-handed. Would you agree? Most people are right-handed. If a right-handed person hits a person on his right cheek, how does he do that? Okay, so I know many of us are a little older. We used to watch Westerns all the time. Even Star Trek back in the day, they didn't have an episode there wasn't a fist fight. I mean, this is every episode. It's kind of crazy when you look back on it, but they would always fight people. And they would make a fist, and they would hit somebody, right? Right-handed, which cheek gets hit with a right-handed punch? It'd be the person's left cheek. But if I hit your right cheek and I'm right-handed, how do I do that? Typically, what we're talking about here is someone would use a backhand, they call it, and they would take the hand out and they would slap the person with the back of their hand. So if a right-handed person hits someone on the right cheek, it was a backhand slap. Now, typically when somebody does that, that's not an attempt to hurt somebody or beat them up. It's an insult. You may have seen people before. I challenge you to a duel, right? So the person says, okay. In this case, we don't respond. We don't say, okay, we'll fight with you. We're going to say, no, that's not a threat to me. I'm not going to cooperate with that. That's simply, you're trying to get me to fight. I'm not going to do it. On the other hand, if we're in a big brawl, that might be a different story. But a lot of people believe that what Jesus was saying with using the term the right cheek was that the person that hit him was doing so simply as an insult to get him to react. He didn't go for it. And of course, neither should we. But either way, I believe that this smiting was an insult more than anything else. And I think the point here is that we shouldn't retaliate over a mere insult. That's not something we should do. But continuing on with Jesus, was Jesus himself ever armed with a weapon? Presuming he was going to fight, of course. After all, Jesus is our example. If we see that he's armed himself with a weapon, wouldn't that be an example, an indication that it might be okay for us to do so as well, if we chose to? Well, let's look at Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 5, and we'll look at verse 13. That's Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. Now here the Israelites were heading into the promised lands. The manna had ceased. Anyway, let's pick up the story in chapter 5, verse 13. Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, they lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said unto him, Are you for us, or for our adversaries? I'm sorry. I'll get it right. So anyway, Joshua sees a man he obviously doesn't recognize. He asked the man whose side he's on. Are you on our side or the adversary's side? Verse 14 rather. And he said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. So this man identified himself as the captain of the host of the Lord. So who was this man? Well, notice Joshua's reaction as we continue. Continuing in verse 14. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What says my Lord unto his servant? Joshua now believes this man was not a man at all. Rather, he was, as we know today, excuse me one second. Joshua now believed this man was not a man at all. Rather, he was who we know today as Jesus Christ. Just as he'd appeared on Mount Sinai before, verse 15. And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, Loose your shoe from off your foot, for the face whereon you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. Now, this was not one of God's angels. An angel would have told Joshua not to worship him. They always did, usually. Also, Joshua was told to remove his shoe because he was standing on holy ground. Just as Moses had been instructed when he met God, the time he went to investigate the burning bush. And of course, this wasn't the Father. John chapter 1, verse 18 tells us that no man has seen God, meaning the Father, at any time. So let's believe that the being Joshua encountered was indeed Jesus Christ himself. But notice in verse 13 that he had a sword drawn. He had a sword with him. We won't turn over to Revelation 19, verse 11 today, but I think we remember that Christ is said to return riding a white horse, and he carries a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations. Revelation 11, verse 21 tells us that the remnant will be slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse. So we see that Jesus Christ is seen wearing or possessing a sword at least. So that's an example that he gave us. But did Jesus actually go as far as to command his disciples to arm themselves, to have their own swords? Was there ever a place in the Bible he actually commanded them to do this? Luke chapter 10. Let's take a look at there. Luke chapter 10. We'll begin in verse 1. Now in Luke chapter 10, Jesus sent the disciples out to spread the gospel. Actually, he appointed 70 additional men for this task. But when he sent them out, he told them not to take a bag for money or one to contain food or not even take any extra shoes, that they would be okay. Again, Luke chapter 10, verse 1. After these things, the Lord appointed other 70 also, and sent them 2 and 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself would come. Therefore said he unto them, The harvest is truly great, but the laborers are few. Pray you therefore the Lord of the harvest that he would send forth laborers into his harvest. That was Jesus speaking there. But notice how the people were sent out. Verse 3. This is what Jesus told them. He said, Go your ways. Behold, I send you forth as lambs among wolves. Look at verse 4. Carry neither purse, nor scrip, nor shoes, and salute no man by the way. Now, when they were sent out there, they were told specifically not to carry a purse for money, and therefore presumably no money. They were told specifically not to carry a scrip for food. And I'm assuming that meant they took no food on their journey. They were not to even carry an extra pair of shoes. It looks like they were just sent out with the clothes on their backs. Wow. Let's move over 10 chapters, if you would, to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, verse 35. Now, the night Jesus was betrayed, a short time later here, he knew he'd be leaving his disciples soon, at least in a physical sense. You might notice that now he gives his disciples very different instructions about what they were to take with them, unlike what he said before. Again, Luke 22, verse 35. Now here's what he says as he's about to leave. And he said to them, When I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, lacked you anything? And they said, Nothing. Then he said to them, But now, he that has a purse, let him take it, and likewise a scrip. And he that has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Now notice what verse 36 really says. And most people just gloss over this. They don't pay a lot of attention to it. But notice that Jesus says, at this point, if anyone has a purse for money, they should take it. Presumably with money in it, of course. I'm going to assume that. Also, notice their scrip. If anyone had a scrip, they were to take it with them also. A scrip was often used for carrying food, and I presume that they may take some food with them. But he told them to carry both those items, both a purse and a scrip, if they had one. He didn't mention their shoes this time. But again, he didn't tell them to go out and buy those items or procure those items. He just said, if you have them, take them. But there's another item mentioned in verse 36, and that was a sword. Didn't mention that the first time. Now, most people think that this sword was probably something called a dirk, or a fairly short sword. You might call it a really long knife, depending on your perspective. And they may have been around 20 inches long, but we're not sure. But they were typically used as a defensive weapon. And again, the purse and scrip were not mandatory. In other words, if they had them, they should take them with them. Assuming that they didn't have them, they didn't need to have them. But this wasn't the case with the sword. He that has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. So Jesus told his disciples that if they did not have a sword, leaving without one was not an option, not as a purse and a scrip were. In fact, if they didn't have a sword, they were to sell one of their garments and get one. Now, things were probably getting a little more dangerous after Christ was taken away from his disciples. A lot had happened. And he told them to arm themselves. And a sword, especially a short one, is a defensive weapon. Verse 37. For I say to you that this that is written must yet be accomplished in me. What prophecy was Jesus talking about here? Let's read on. And he was reckoned among the transgressors. You look back and find almost the exact same words in Isaiah 53, verse 12, by the way. That was where it was prophesied in the Old Testament. For the things concerning me have an end. Verse 38. And they, the disciples, said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. Well, it might seem a bit odd because Jesus appears to have just instructed all the disciples to have a sword, not to leave without one, even if they had to buy one. Now, here it appears they only had 2 swords total between the bunch of them. If so, then most of the disciples did not have a sword. And that may have been the case. But some today actually believe that people back in those days often carried 2 swords. One being much shorter and used as a utility knife. And actually it was a knife they used to, whatever they used it for back in those days. They carried a longer one, and that one was for defense. So a short one for utility work, whatever it was, fixing food, whatever, and the longer one was strictly for the use of defense. Since the Bible says they said, is it possible that each disciple had 2 swords, basically a knife and a sword, and that's the response to Jesus? So maybe all of them had 2 swords. I don't know. Just a thought. And it really doesn't matter, because regardless of the number of swords, the disciples did possess swords. They did carry swords. We'll see that in a minute. Let's go to John 18, verse 3 to look at this. That's John chapter 18. We'll see about if they're actually carrying these swords that Jesus commanded them to have. That's John chapter 18, verse 3. Again, that's later this night. And this is when the soldiers came to take Jesus. And we'll see that at least Peter carried a sword that night when the soldiers came to take Jesus. Again, John 18, verse 3. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said to them, Whom seek you? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed them, stood with them. As soon then as he had said to them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way. So Jesus asked the soldiers that if they just wanted him, let his disciples go free. Let them go. Verse 9. That the saying might be fulfilled, which he spake, of them which thou gavest me, have I lost none. Verse 10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. That servant's name was Malcus. Now, obviously Peter had a sword. What was Peter trying to do when he cut off Malchus' ear? What do we think he was trying to do? Well, I believe it's obvious he was trying to defend Jesus Christ. You know, Jesus told his disciples, he taught them. He told his disciples in John 15, verse 13, that greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Now, Peter and the rest of the disciples were likely no match for these soldiers, and they probably would have been killed had they continued the attack. But Peter probably believed that he was actually defending Jesus. He was trying to protect Jesus, just as Jesus had taught him to do. So how did Jesus react to Peter's attack on Malchus? Did he condemn Peter for drawing his weapon and attacking the soldier, or for having a weapon in the first place? Verse 11, let's see what he said. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up your sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Jesus knew what was about to happen to him. He just prayed to the Father about it, if you recall, in the garden. But he knew that this was a very important part of God's great plan. We know that Jesus always does the will of the Father. This was meant to be. this wasn't the right time for Peter to defend Christ. Not here, not now. So Jesus just told Peter to return his sword to its sheath. It wasn't that Peter was doing anything wrong, at least as far as he understood. It just wasn't the right time. Jesus, at this point, didn't want to be defended. The point is that Jesus did not condemn Peter for having the sword, nor for deploying it. Jesus simply told Peter to put the sword up for now. Jesus didn't want to be defended. Jesus actually commanded his disciples to carry a sword for defense. But what would have happened if Peter's attack had killed Malcus, rather than just cutting off his ear? How would that have gone down? Obviously, he might have been killed if this fight ensued, but that's not the question I'm trying to ask. What I'm saying is, what happens if anyone, not just Peter here, what happens if anyone does in fact die as a result of us defending ourselves? Whether it was Peter or us, it'd be the same thing. Does the Bible address that? What happens if someone dies as a result of us defending ourselves or someone else? Let's turn to Exodus 22, verse 2, where we can see something that might shed some light on this. That's Exodus chapter 22 and verse 2. A lot of twos there. I believe the scripture here can be a bit confusing at times. I know people are confused by it. Let's see if we can make some sense out of it. Again, that's Exodus 22, and we'll start right there in verse 2 at the beginning, practically. Again, people argue about the meaning of this. Let's see what you think. Exodus 22, verse 2. If a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, there shall be no blood be shed for him. Now, breaking up here is a word, it's a Hebrew word, 4290 in Strong's. It's maktereth. It means a burglary. And smitten, of course, means to strike or possibly severely wound. God's word reads this way. If anyone catches a thief breaking in and hits him so that he dies, he is not guilty of murder. So this verse tells us, if someone's breaking into our home and we use physical force against them and they end up dying as a result, there has been no murder committed. The one defending their home is not guilty of anything. And notice there's no time of day mentioned in verse 2 here. That may seem obvious, but when many people read verse 3, they seem to believe it's only okay to defend our homes at night when it's dark. Let's take a look at that, verse 3. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him. Apparently there's a crime been committed. For he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. So some believe that striking a burglar so that he died would be murder if it occurred during the daytime, but not when it's dark. And this never made any sense to me. It just never did. So something doesn't seem right here. I mean, should it matter what time of day that someone breaks into our home? Maybe burglars should always wait for the sun to come up and be daylight so they can be assured that Christians won't ever hinder their burglary. Of course, for fear the burglar could be injured and possibly die if they resist. So that would give burglars a free pass. Should a person be unable to defend his home just because it occurs during the day? A burglary does, that is? What do you think? Let's look at verse 3 again. I'll read that one more time. It says, if the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him, for he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he should be sold for his theft. Now here's what I suspect was meant by verse 3. Now let's say that the burglar is not killed during this defense, but possibly subdued. Then what? Well, if he's subdued and can't cause any harm, killing someone at that point is murder. There's no reason for it. Suppose when confronted, a burglar just gives up and doesn't fight, says, I give up. Sorry, I've stopped. Or maybe the defender is a big, strong man and is physically able to overpower the burglar and restrain him and stop him from what he's doing. Now, at that point, what should happen? Well, to kill someone at that point who's no longer a threat, that would be murder. For example, a criminal in a gunfight with the police might get shot and killed during the gunfight, but the police were defending themselves. If the man surrenders, or maybe somebody comes up behind him and subdues him, then he's no longer a threat. If the police shoot and kill him then, that would, of course, be murder, and obviously the wrong thing to do. What should the police do with this criminal if they're able to capture him alive? Well, they would take him to have justice served. You might have to go to jail, pay a fine, or maybe make restitution for a crime or crimes that he's committed. If you stole money from someone, he might be required to pay the money back, possibly with extra money for the pain, suffering, and aggravation the victim may have suffered. But killing the man after the crime is over and the man is caught would be murder. Any police officer or anyone else for that matter would be guilty of murder. Let's look at verse 3 one more time. If the blood be risen upon him, if the sun be risen upon him, there should be blood shed for him. So I think the idea here is, well, what does it mean that the sun is risen upon him? I'll get it out. Well, I suspect that means that this man is still alive to live for another day. Now, if we die today, the sun doesn't rise for us the next day. If it does, then we're still living. We're still alive. Now, if the burglar survives the defense offered by the one defending his home, killing him when the threat is over would be murder, because at that point, the burglar should be making restitution for his crime, as we just read. He shouldn't be killed. It's the same today. If someone breaks into our home, whether day or night, and we use deadly force to stop the person, we're justified and not guilty of murder should that person die. On the other hand, once the burglar is stopped and presents no further threat, killing him in cold blood, you might say, would be a crime. No, instead, at this point, the burglar needs to make restitution, not be killed or murdered because of his crime. So I believe if the burglar survives the encounter and is still alive, when the sun comes up, that he should be required to make restitution, just as the Bible says at that point, but he should not be killed. Anyway, I suspect that Exodus 22, verse 3, simply means that if a person breaks into someone's home and is killed as part of someone's defense, the person defending themselves, their family, and their home is not guilty. But if the burglar is killed after his threat's over, maybe the next day, then one would be guilty of murder. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking. You can see what you make of that. At any rate, we can see in verse 2 that there is no prohibition against defending our home against a burglar, even if it results in the burglar's death. Now, what about defending someone else? What if someone else is incapable of defending themselves and maybe they're being attacked? Should we ever consider defending them from physical harm should someone attack them? What do you think? Proverbs 24. If you would, turn to Proverbs chapter 24, and we'll look at verse 10. I'd like to read this to you in the easy-to-read version of the Bible. Now, again, the question is it okay to defend others as well as ourselves and our families? In Proverbs 24, verse 10, I'll be reading, as I said, from the easy-to-read version. That's Proverbs 24, verse 10. It says, "If you're weak in times of trouble, that is real weakness. If you see someone on their way to death or in danger of being killed, you must do something to save them. You cannot say, 'It's none of my business.' The Lord knows everything, and He knows why you do things. He watches you, and He will pay you back for what you do." Now, according to Proverbs 24, verse 11, we should come to the aid of others. In fact, that's what Peter was trying to do when he attacked the soldier that was trying to take Jesus. So to conclude today, does God tell us that we cannot defend ourselves, our loved ones, our brethren, or even a stranger perhaps? Physically defending ourselves opens up the possibility of the death of the attacker. But should we never defend ourselves due to that remote possibility? We saw that the Jews worked to rebuild the wall with one hand on their work, and the other hand, they held a weapon. We saw in Psalms that we are to defend the poor and the fatherless. Jesus Christ appeared to Joshua wielding a sword. And Revelation gives us the image of Christ returning with a sword. Jesus actually commanded his disciples to have a sword. If they didn't have one, they were to sell some of their clothes and get one. We saw in Exodus 22, verse 2, that if anyone catches a thief breaking in and hits him so that he dies, he is not guilty of murder. In fact, the sixth of the 10 Commandments reads, "You shall not kill," in the King James, but the correct translation is that we are not to do murder. In Proverbs, we're told that we should try to do something to save someone if they're in danger of being killed. We shouldn't just say, "This is none of our business." We should actually help them. For the most part, we've all lived in relative peace and safety. But as the Ukrainians might tell us, we never know what the future might bring. We do have the right and possibly the duty to defend ourselves and others. We should prayerfully consider our own position on our defense. If we decide never to defend ourselves and our families, we need to be ready to accept the potential loss of life and property that could bring. If we decide to offer defense, we need to be very, very careful and very deliberate in our preparation for our defense. Perhaps better door locks might be a form of defense for our family. On the other hand, some might opt to go to weapons for defense. Now, the sword was a common defensive weapon in Jesus' day. Everything from pepper sprays to firearms are available today. These tools can be dangerous, even to ourselves and our families, if not stored and used properly. They often require much training, practice, and the right mindset to properly deploy in an emergency. Using potentially deadly force could always result in someone's death, something we never intend to do, but in this case, we'd have to be willing to accept those consequences. If we don't feel like we can use a weapon properly for whatever reason, then maybe we shouldn't have one. They might create an even more dangerous situation for us. So this is something I can't advise you on. But regardless, we should all at least have a plan and know what we intend to do should this situation ever arise. At least have a plan. Now, let's pray that we never find ourselves in a situation where we do indeed need to defend ourselves. But should we one day find ourselves in this position, know that our Bibles tell us that defending ourselves, our families, and even someone we don't know is not a sin. Each of us must make our own choices based on our own specific situations and what we believe God would have us do after much thought and very much prayer. While we should always be prepared, I pray that none of us will ever have the need to defend ourselves or others.